Right, guys, today we've got something a little bit different, something pretty crazy, something I thought could be kind of fun, and I was really curious to see what would happen. So, we've got a sand track here. We've got a Sandwick, one of the throwback tracks from the Reflex throwback track DLC, and we have max terrain deformation and the rain turned on. And I'll tell you what, the first two laps, I wanted to show you lap 1 and 2, but this track gets brutal. It gets insanely difficult, insanely rough, tons of ruts. The way it tears up it's fun. It was a fun experience, but it was punishing. It was very, very punishing. And the track, it's a sand track, so it has pretty good drag on the bike. But then you add in the rainy conditions and whoa. Punishing. Punishing and brutal is the best way to explain it. You'll probably hear me say those words multiple times throughout this video. But I want to show you the first two laps because the first lap, even with the rain and the way the track is sandy and whatnot, it was okay. We had a smooth track in front of us and no terrain deformation yet. It worked out perfectly fine, right? By lap 2, it was already getting really, really, really ruddy. I had the maximum amount of AI bots you can have in the game. I'm not sure if that's 15. I don't remember, but we turned that on to maximum, and here you can see it's already rutting up really, really good. And it's actual ruts, so remember I say that because at the end of the video, it gets a bit weird. It gets a bit weird, and the roughness changes from ruts to something else, and we'll talk about it when we get to that point, but we went 30 laps. I did the full 30 laps. It was, again, punishing and brutal, and by the end, it was fun, but by the end, I was just trying to survive. I was just trying to get it done. I was kind of done and wanted to be done with the race because it was getting so difficult. Now, this jump, I want to talk about the jumps a bit throughout the video, but this jump, it got to the point after the first few laps where I gave up even trying to get it. The corner before it is kind of a wide, sweeping corner, but the ruts and the roughness got so bad, I couldn't even maintain momentum and speed to even hit that jump, really. So, and the face of the jump got really weird and really torn away and rough, and it just wasn't even worth trying to hit that jump anymore because I couldn't do it, or even if I could, I was kind of crashing. Now, I do crash a bunch, or I did crash. I crashed in the video some, but I crashed a bunch doing this challenge. It was because of how rough the track was. So I would crash because eventually, and you see it in the video, I do show you a specific instance of it, but at one point in the video, there's some really big, holes that form on the track, which is really cool. It makes it more realistic. I mean, these huge holes that were forming, and I get caught out in one. I didn't see it, and I go down. It's in this corner. I don't know if it's this lap. It might be here. No, it's not here. It's the next lap. So you can see them kind of forming on the outside, and I was trying to, at this point, still try to find a smooth line to take, but it was kind of getting impossible. The bots take the same line for the most part, but they kind of jump around the track, and the bots were crashing a bunch and whatnot. But back to why I was crashing. So I'd crash because of these big holes in the track, or because I would get cross-rutted or land in a rut a weird way, and it was really cool. It was kind of realistic, but at the same time, when the track got really, 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 really bad later on, I was crashing and not really sure why. I was landing on a spot that seemed to be okay. I didn't really get cross-rutted, and I would still go down. So the terrain deformation, it really pushes the limits of the physics in this game. It does. I'm not saying it's bad, but this terrain deformation is so crazy on this track that sometimes you go down even if it doesn't really feel like you should. But other times you go down because of a semi-realistic way. Cross rut, land in a rut bad, a huge hole, and the bike just gets sucked down into it and you go down. But the jumps, some of the jumps were really bad and were getting worse, but other jumps would get better the longer the race went on, because there was like a bunch of ruts going up the faces of some of the jumps, and then it was tough to hit them if you didn't get into the rut right. But later in the race, those ruts kind of formed into one big smooth rut, and then it made it easier to take it. That big triple, quad, double, whatever it is at the end was easier to take at the end of the race than it was in the middle of the race because of that reason. But here we hit a big hole. You can see some huge cutouts on the track. It's so cool. It's so incredibly rough, and while it is punishing and debatable whether how fun it is, it was still cool, and I do recommend, if you haven't done this, you really need to. Now on that table, you could kind of see where the terrain deformation was like eating away the face of that jump and pushing the lip of that jump back, and that changed the way that jump felt. So the terrain deformation is quite elaborate, I guess, and works quite well. I would assume if you had a full lobby and did 30 laps on this track in multiplayer, it would obviously rut up and tear up a bit different and deteriorate a bit different, but I would really like to see, I wish I could get that put together somehow, you know, get a private lobby put together with whatever it is, 15 players, and then run this for 30 laps and just see how it ruts up compared to with the bots. But even with the bots, it got crazy. So we're on lap 21 here, kind of going through it pretty quickly, but the terrain deformation and the roughness of the track started to change at this point. You know, sometimes when you run max deformation, it feels like it's kind of done by lap 15 or maybe even lap 20. It doesn't really feel like it can get worse. Well, it kind of did here. So the reason it got worse wasn't because necessarily more ruts were forming, but what was happening was we had a set amount of ruts forming on the track, but then between myself and the AI, we were crossing those ruts and then tearing a new rut through that. So what was happening was there were like triangles of dirt starting to form, and when you hit that in the corners, especially in the corners it was happening, the bike is like bouncing and jumping all over the place. So again, it was really pushing the physics of the game because of how rough it gets. Plus, you got to remember, Sandwick and Sugar Ridge, I would assume, is the same. These two tracks are pre-made rough and bumpy to begin with, and then adding in the max deformation with the rain and the wet conditions, it was punishing. It was punishing and brutal, and by lap 25, ready for the race to be done. I really wanted to be done, but I was committed to doing the full 30 laps. I mean, I crashed so much. We don't have a big lead on the AI, and my lap times aren't very good because of the conditions and how much I was crashing. After lap 5, I started to go down all the time, but it was really satisfying. It didn't happen too much because it's really hard to pick and choose a line when it gets this bad, but it was really satisfying getting into a rut and railing the rut and getting a good drive and line out of it when you could. But at this point, you know, this late in the race, it was like almost impossible just because of how rough it was. But this is some of the, maybe the nastiest terrain deformation I've seen in an MX versus ATV game. But it did the track justice because Sandwick and Reflex could get really rough. Reflex had great terrain deformation, and I'm glad they decided to do this. So I highly recommend you try this out. If you haven't, you would have to have this track. You'd have to let me know in the comments if there is a different track, you know, a stock track that does similar terrain deformation to this. But this, as far as I could tell, is the roughest, nastiest, most brutal and punishing track with max terrain deformation in the game. I know Track DR has had some really crazy terrain deformation. MX Sim, MX Bikes can have really wild terrain deformation too, but for an MX versus ATV game, this goes hard. This track goes really hard when you do this. So punishing, fun, yet kind of not fun at the very end. And some people will say, well, it should get like that. I actually have rode pure sand. I've rode like beach sand before in real life a couple times. There was a track I went to quite a ways from where I live that was pure sand. And yes, it does get punishing and brutal, but in the game, it really pushes the physics. The physics can get a bit weird. The bike gets really bouncy, and the bike feels really hard, you know, really solid. I'm not really sure. Sometimes it doesn't really feel like the bike absorbs the roughness that well, but it could be kind of how my bike set up, and just because that's the way the physics are. But let me know in the comments if you have tried this on this track and what do you think about it. Or again, if you know of another track that tears up and gets this ruddy and this insane and this crazy and wild and whatnot. But you guys and girls are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for the support on the channel lately. It really does mean a lot. And until the next video, take it easy.